Jessica James, the recycling coordinator for Mill Creek Township, and joining me today is Brittany Preshak, the Erie County Sustainability Coordinator. And we're here today to talk to you with the Mill Creek Government Channel about backyard composting. It's a beautiful sunny day and we are excited to come out here and talk to you about this. There are many, many benefits to composting, and Mill Creek Township certainly encourages you to do this. I know a lot of people have reservations about starting their first bin and are maybe a little afraid or apprehensive to do so. We are going to dispel any rumors you have heard about the horrors of composting. We are not going to let odors happen in your bin. We're not going to attract any vermin, and it's not going to be unsightly. So Brittany and I are going to take the time today to go over the benefits of backyard composting with you. And Brittany's got a few examples and some statistics of why backyard composting is beneficial on a grander scale.
Absolutely. So we always think about our waste stream. It's the recycling and stuff we put at the curbside that ends up going up to the landfill. When we actually look at that waste stream and all the components of it, there's really kind of three different pieces. There's what should go to the landfill, there's what we can divert through recycling, and then there's what we can actually divert through composting. And of that 100% of our waste stream, 67% of that is actually compostable, and only 13% really should be going to the landfill. So when you think about what you put out at your curbside every week or every other week, think about actually how much you put out there. And a lot of that we can actually divert through composting, which is why we're here today.
Composting is not only beneficial, like Brittany said, on a grander scale to Erie County as a whole. It's beneficial to you as the resident to get rid of some of these items and not sending it to the landfill, but it's also beneficial to the plants and to the environment. On the smaller scale, composting does help the plants. It helps to supply organic material to those plants slowly. It attracts earthworms, which are good for the soil and for breaking down those organic materials, and it also stimulates beneficial microorganisms.
Composting actually also helps to retain water for your plants. That way you don't have to water them quite as much. They help to keep in that water so that it doesn't just dry up. Another great benefit of composting is that actually it helps retain a lot of the nutrients that your plants need to grow, and it actually releases them much slower so that you don't burn out your plants, and they actually have it to last a lot longer than just putting regular potting soil down or using your traditional topsoil. So we've just finished talking about the great benefits of composting, and we're all excited to get ready. So let's actually talk about what are those materials you need to really just start composting. The most basic and obvious one is some kind of composting bin. We have two examples for you guys here. The first is a stationary bin. This is basically just a way to pile up your compost. We also have a rotating bin, which we'll explain how it works later, but it's more of a active composting bin because you're actually rotating it. You get a little bit more faster speed on your composting. The other type is you don't have to buy a bin. You can actually make a space to compost. It's very simple. You just basically need something to create three sides. You can use wood pallets, you can use lumber, bricks, concrete blocks. And the reason you do kind of three sides is two purposes. One is to kind of keep the animals out of it. You don't want anyone going in for food. And also kind of aesthetics. It actually kind of blocks the view of that compost while it's working.
Great, and then I'm going to talk about a few other smaller items that you might need. You don't have to purchase. You can certainly find these at your local store or online, or even find some items out of your house. But a few things I've got here, and most important after your backyard compost bin, is your kitchen compost pail. You need something actually in your kitchen next to the sink to hold the food scraps or other items until you're ready to take them outside. Another item we've got here, in case you don't want to purchase a kitchen compost pail, is maybe just a coffee tin will work, or a glass jar. Anything you can find around the house will work. I've got a shovel here for when you're ready to take the compost out. I have got some kitchen scissors for cutting some items down into smaller pieces. A nice watering can to add water to your compost. We've got a screener here, and you don't even have to purchase this. This was actually homemade with some lumber and some chicken wire fencing. And then finally, we have a thermometer for you to take the temperature of the piles.
So we know what kind of materials we actually need to get started. So let's talk about what is the process of actual composting. So composting is basically recycling naturally. It happens in nature. It's the breakdown of those organic materials, which is anything that used to be living. So you're talking about your grass, your leaves, food waste, all of that stuff. That's kind of the process of breaking all of that down. Usually how it works is you've got some kind of microbacteria that start to eat away at your food waste, your organics, start to break it down into little tiny pieces, and it comes out as a soil. That's what you end up getting. It's kind of bacterial waste. So we've got two different types of composting. We've got a passive, which is basically your stationary bin. You end up just leaving this go. It sits, you take your lid off, place all of your food waste, your browns, which is your dry materials, into the compost. You might want to flip it and turn it so that you get some aeration into it, but this basically just stays put. The second type is the active type. And active means it's going to be a little bit faster process, and how it works is we've got a bin here. Lid comes off just like that. Put the lid back on, and then we rotate. That's your form of aeration. So there are actually 4 important components to composting. It's your recipe, essentially. So we've already talked about aeration. That's important because the bacteria needs oxygen in order to break down the organic material. So with this one, you have to turn it yourself. With an active one, it turns itself. It's got holes in the side to pull in that air as you're rotating. The other 3 important pieces, obviously you need your organic material. So your food waste, leaves, grass, anything that wants to be living or that was once living, those will be your kind of main ingredients. The last 2 is moisture. So we need some kind of moisture and water. Usually that comes from your greens, and we'll explain what greens are in a little bit here, but that's your water. If your compost is too dry, that's what we have a watering can for. You can add water to your compost, and you'll know when it's too dry. If it's crumbly, then we need to add a little bit extra water. The last thing important is the temperature, and that's why we have a temperature probe. This kind of helps you figure out what the right temperature is. You want to be between 120 and 140 degrees to have optimal breakdown of the material. So even if you don't want to purchase a temperature probe, the easiest way is to just open up your bin, stick your hand in. If it's hot to the touch, you're probably pretty good. And those are the 4 important ingredients. You want to watch those during the entire composting process.
As Brittany mentioned, we have got a passive style bin here. It's a passive stationary bin. Over here, we have our active rotating tumbler bin. So when we refer to the 2 bins, I want you to keep in mind that this one's passive and stationary and that one's active and rotating, okay? But the way these 2 bins work is a little bit differently from each other, but they still are nice to complement each other. For this one, you can fill it all of the way up. You're going to want to do different things, and we're going to mention what's going to be put into the bin. But you're going to fill it all the way up. You're going to take the lid off. And to help add that air that she was talking about, you're going to grab a pitchfork or a shovel and actually reach inside and try and turn the materials to aerate the materials inside this passive bin. When this bin has finished composting, what you're going to do is take this lid off the front, and the finished compost will actually be underneath and will start to spill out the front entrance here of this compost bin. This bin here is an active bin, okay? So what you're going to do is spin it to make sure that it composts fully. Then you can add 3/4 of the way full, but make sure you stop adding so that way everything inside can compost. When it's done composting, the compost is going to reduce in size to about half full. At that point, then you can take this bin to your garden and empty it out. What I want to mention here is this is a single batch system. So you want to add materials until it's 3/4 of the way full, and then stop adding materials so you can spin. This might take a few months, anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months to finish composting fully. But this single batch system can then be used on your compost. I will warn you that if you continue to add to this bin, it'll just restart the process. You're not doing anything wrong, you're not going to hurt your compost, but it will just restart the process if you don't stop adding. These 2 are nice to complement each other because you can add for this bin And when it's full, you can spin, and then you can use this bin as a holding tank while you're letting this bin finish composting. Another thing I want to add is the placement of the bin in your yard. It's very important to keep in mind that most times your compost bin are black in color, which makes them good to attract sunlight. Sunlight's good to help break it down quickly, and for the placement of your bin, you're going to want to put it in sunlight and either close to your garden or close to your house, but you're going to use your compost bin more if it's more convenient for you.
All right, so we've talked about this a couple of times, greens versus browns. So what exactly does that mean? Well, first off, so your greens, that's your nitrogen, which you're adding into your compost, and your browns, that's your carbon. Not really need to worry about nitrogen versus carbon. We're gonna talk about really the specific examples of what greens versus browns are, and that's what you'll want to remember. So the first thing is there's a ratio. You have to actually have 1 part greens, so things like grass, to 2 parts of your browns. So remember that ratio, a 1 to 2. That's going to help make sure that you've got the proper moisture, temperature, and ingredients into your composting. So let's turn it over to Jessie and let her talk about some of the brown examples.
Okay, so as Brittany mentioned, I've got the browns here. And what we wanted to do for you guys was really create a visual. This is when we hold our compost workshops, this is really what we like to show people. So the closest we could come to brown, 2 pink containers and a green, here is this blue container. Okay, so always keep that in mind, like she said. Your browns are your bulking agent. They decay very slowly, and they don't usually smell as they decompose. They don't contain a lot of water, so when you do have a lot of greens, grasses, foods, things like that, it's nice to add browns to your greens to help absorb some of that water or some of that moisture. Also, in case you don't have a lot of greens, browns may be composted by themselves on their own, and they won't smell. The process will work beautifully. Okay, so those are the characteristics of your browns. Specifically, what are your browns? Well, I've got here a pile of leaves. Leaves obviously tend to accumulate in the spring and fall, so some people like to stockpile their brown leaves. A couple other things we have here on the table with us. We've got the wood chips that we've also mentioned. We've got newspaper, which you'll want to shred. We've got brown paper bags here and a toilet paper tube. Again, since this has a hollow center, it's nice to add this to your compost pile as a bulking agent, and it helps to aerate the pile inside since it has the hole already. Okay? I would like to turn it over to Brittany now, and she can talk a little bit more about what your greens are.
Sure. So the greens, as Jessie talked about what browns are, so your greens are actually what's going to decay the fastest. They're very high in moisture, which is why we add those browns. That helps to absorb a lot of that moisture so you don't end up with soaking wet compost. The other thing is the greens are what's going to smell as it breaks down. So when you start to have that rotten egg smell, you don't have too many greens, and you want to add some extra browns to absorb that smell and that moisture. So make sure you don't just compost your greens, because if you do, you're going to have that really rotten egg smell, and it's going to be very difficult to get rid of. Plus, you're going to have such high moisture, it's going to be dripping water, but not just water, but decomposed water with all that brown guck in it. So make sure you always add greens and browns to your compost. So let's talk about some examples. Well, one of the easy things is fruit. Right? We've got bananas. You want to add banana peels. These might be a little bit big, so you can always cut these down like you do with your newspaper. Another fun one to do is eggshells. So we've got some eggshells here. You might want to rinse them out before you add them to your compost. That way you don't get any egg in there, just the shell part. You don't have to crunch them, but you can into little pieces. Other great examples, coffee grinds. Coffee grains are very great, and so are your tea bags. Now remember, when you're adding your tea bags though, they've got staples in them. So don't forget to take out that staple, otherwise they'll end up in your finished product. Other good examples, and the obvious ones, are some vegetables. So you can just do celery stalks after you've cut it up, some leeks, tomatoes, peppers, any of that excess vegetable waste, that can go right into your compost. Another good example that some people don't even think about is pasta. So this is actually pasta. You can do pasta and rice after it's cooked and it's just left over in the fridge. But remember, if you're gonna do pasta, make sure there's no sauce on it. You just want the pasta itself. So just a couple other greens to mention. Grass is a fantastic green to add to your compost. Other greens are some garden residue, so any extra leaves from some plants, any of the stalks from your vegetable plants. You can also add in, if you want to, some manure, cow manure, not animal waste. So just think about that.
A few other browns not mentioned on the table again, and there's so many things I'm sure you can find online or in books, but there's so many other things. A few other things we didn't mention actually on the table for browns would be peanut shells, your cardboard, and straw or hay. We want to segue into now what we can't add, okay? This seems like we're doing a really good job here talking about what you should put into your compost pile, but we want to talk about a few things you shouldn't be adding. Brittany did mention the staples on the tea bags. Another thing you'll catch in your compost later that we've all experienced, when you are cutting up your banana peels or putting a banana peel in, always make sure to take off the plastic sticker because that won't decompose. So I think that's a good segue into what not to add to your compost bin.
All right, so now I know we've talked about what you can add to your composter, but questions always come up. What can't I add and why not? So we're gonna cover a couple different things here on the table and some others that aren't on the table. So the first thing is you don't wanna add weeds to your compost. You might think, oh, that's a green, it's just a garden residue. But the reason you don't wanna do that is you might end up with weed seeds in your compost. And if that doesn't break it down, when you go to use it, you'll get those weeds coming right back up again. The other thing you don't want to add is things that have seeds in them. So pine cones are actually a good example of two different things you don't want to add. So there are seeds inside of the pine cone when it opens. So you don't want to add this in, otherwise you could end up with pine trees growing in your garden. The other reason is pine actually adds acidity to your soil. So you add this to your compost and it breaks down, your soil could be too acidic and you won't have anything grow. Another example is fertilizer. Now obviously no one's gonna think you can pour this chemical into your compost, but think about when you cut your grass. We already said that grasses are green and you can add that to your compost. But if you use fertilizers or chemicals on your grass, you don't wanna add that grass to it. Chemicals, it's just chemicals. You don't wanna add that to your compost. It'll end up affecting whatever you grow in that compost. So just think about that. A couple other things is shiny paper, magazines or inserts from your newspaper. Although these are a brown, this is shiny paper. It takes a while to break down and you don't know what kind of chemicals are in the ink. And so you really just don't want to add any kind of shiny, silky paper to your compost. The last thing to talk about that I want to touch on is any kind of food that you add, say olive oil, salad dressings. Those are oils and they don't break down in your compost. So you don't want to add any type of olive oil or vinegar, salad dressings. We did talk about pastas, so don't add pastas that already have the sauce on it either. Those just take a while to break down, so it's a little harder.
Those are some good examples, Brittany. I have a few more that we frequently get questions on at our compost workshops. The first one I want to touch on, and I don't have a sample, but I think everybody gets the hint when we're going to say no cat litter or dog feces. People always ask because what we do recommend you putting in your compost pile is horse manure if you want to. You certainly don't have to, but again, cat and dog feces are a definite no-no. These carry diseases and E. coli. You don't want to add that to your compost bin. The next thing would be milk, dairy, yogurts, or ice cream. I don't have an example of that, but those are things that you don't want to add to your compost pile. Those spoil, they'll attract pests and vermin. Just leave those out of your compost pile. Another thing you don't want to add to your compost pile, I've got a little sample here of tuna. You don't want to add any meat, fish, chicken, poultry, anything like that. The reason is not that it's not organic and it can't decompose, it certainly can, but in a neighborhood setting, it's gonna have a very foul odor and again, attract unwanted skunks and pests that you don't want near your compost bin. And finally, the last thing you don't wanna add is anything inorganic or plastic, okay? I've got some examples of some latex gloves that sometimes accidentally slip in while you're gardening or composting. I've got a vegetable container here. We talked about the sticker on the banana, or we've got a newspaper here. We've got rubber band around the newspaper and a plastic bag. Of course, the plastic does not decompose in your compost bin. Another thing with plastic that I want to touch on are compostable plastics. Unless you are doing a very high temperature industrial compost bin, you probably don't want to add compostable plastics to your bin. Not that they won't decompose, it will take a very, very long time. Brittany and I have experimented adding a lot of different things to our compost, whether that be compostable plastics or other things. But we've tried it, and we're going to save you the headache and hassle of finding out that it doesn't decompose as fast as you'd like it to, or maybe it had some adverse effect on your compost bin. But we're going to save you the trouble and tell you what not to add to your bin. And we'd like to now move on into some factors that can help speed up that process a little bit. We do have some factors we want you to consider to help speed up the composting process. You certainly don't have to do them, but like I said, it makes things go a little bit faster. So the first thing I want to talk about is the surface volume of some of the materials you put in. Some of them are bulky, like newspapers, banana peels, orange peels. It is always better to cut them up first and then add them to your compost pile. If that takes too long, certainly you can run a newspaper through a paper shredder instead. The next thing you want to do is add aeration to your pile. I know you're going to spin it, which adds air, but you also need to add some bulking agents so those smaller pieces you cut up, when they get wet, don't clump together. A few things you can add inside your bin to help aerate your pile would be paper tube rolls and wood chips. Wood chips are great because they are free out at the Millfair Compost and Recycling Center. You can get as many as you want and then add them to your compost pile as a bulking agent. Another factor you may need to consider if your pile is too dry is just adding a little bit of water to your pile, which is what the watering can is good for. And finally, as Brittany mentioned earlier, it is important to take the temperature of your compost pile. You can either do it with your hand by touch and it feels warm, sticking in the temperature probe, or it fits nicely in the side of the compost bin. The temperature of your compost bin should range from 120 degrees to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The higher temperature of your compost bin, the faster the bacteria works with inside the bin to break down the materials.
All right, so we're getting near to the end here. We've covered the ingredients, we've covered the process of composting and the benefits, and so now let's talk about how do you know when it's done? Well, there are a couple easy ways to tell. The first, your compost, it should look black or a very dark brown. So color is a very easy indicator. You should see no more food waste in your compost either. The other thing, it smells like dirt. It shouldn't smell like food waste anymore. So those are two very easy tests. Another one is, as Jessie mentioned earlier, with a compost bin like this, you're actually going to see a reduction in size. So your bin should only be about half full when it's really done. And that's just because the volume condenses as things break down. Another easy test is moisture. So when you think about a sponge and you wring it out, that is way too wet. So what you want to be able to do is pick up your compost, hold it in your hands. If it clumps without dripping water, you're good. If it's crumbly and starts to fall apart, it's a little too dry. If it wrings out like a sponge, definitely too wet. Another thing to think about is the temperature. So we told you you need that high temperature so that the bacteria can actually efficiently break down your waste. What you want to do is put your hand in your compost bin. If it's a lot cooler than it was when it was composting, you're good too. So those are 4 easy, simple things to think about as you're deciding whether your compost is ready to use. Now, a lot of people ask, well, my compost still smells. You get that ammonia or rotting egg smell. That usually means you've got too many greens in it or it's too wet. So a couple easy ways to get rid of that smell. Put some extra browns in. So put your leaves, some sawdust, some wood chips. That'll help to soak up that moisture and it'll also get rid of that smell. Bugs. Everyone worries when you have bugs near your compost. Bugs aren't necessarily bad. What you don't want to see is maggots. That means you've got flies, and usually that means you put food or meat waste into your compost bin. That we don't want. But other bugs are actually beneficial, so it's okay if you see a couple other bugs flying around your compost. That is not a problem. So these are just a couple of those tips that we, when we're composting, have to think about, and this way you kind of know when your compost is done and ready to use.
Well, we hope you guys are excited to get to this point. We are ready to put the compost on our gardens. With this style of bin, the tumbler style, you may only get 1 or 2 batches of compost out of this bin per year, but that's okay. It works slowly and in its own time. But we're gonna now apply the finished compost to our garden. It's great to add to your garden, but make sure you rototill it in. The compost is not a fertilizer. I do want to stress that. It's not a fertilizer, but it is a soil amendment, very strong with nutrients. So it's very good and it's good practice to mix it into the dirt that's already in your garden.
One of the other applications that you can use is actually as a mulch. What's nice with compost is you can actually put it around your trees as a type of mulch, a surface mulch. Whenever you actually put around trees though, remember, you want to actually spread it out to the drip line, which is the edge of your tree, and then you want to make sure that right around the root bulb that there is no any type of dirt or mulch or compost around that space. If you put it too close to the trunk, then actually what you end up doing is creating a place for bacteria to start to eat away at your tree. So you want to make sure you leave a little bit of a circle around the root and then spread it all the way out to the drip line. And that you don't have to mix that into the soil, just place it right on top and around.
Well, I hope Brittany and I have inspired you guys to get off the couch, to get in your backyard, and start composting and gardening. We've really enjoyed our time instructing you guys, and we want you to feel free to give us a call if you have any questions about anything you've heard during today's show. You can reach my office at 814-833-1111, extension 317, or by my email address, jjames@millcreektownship.com.
Or you can reach me at the county at area code 814-451-6019, or by email at bprischak@eriecounty.gov.org.
If you have any other questions and you need some more resources to help, Brittany and I have read a lot of books, gone online and researched, and we have found some of these books helpful. So feel free to go to the library, pick up a few books. You might get some more tips in here that we didn't give you. So just a few extra resources to think about before you start composting.
And you can always find a lot of stuff online. Just go up on the internet and look up backyard composting, and they'll have a lot of great tips for you. Probably a lot of similar to what we've talked to today, but additional ones as well. So a lot of commercials, they'll tell you don't try this at home, but we want you to try this at home. The whole purpose of today's video is to help teach you how you do backyard composting for yourself. So we hope you've learned a lot today with us.
Thank you so much again for tuning in to the Mill Creek Government Channel.
You're watching the Mill Creek Government Channel, powered by WQLN Public Media.